Are we rolling?
We're rolling.
Normally people ask me that.
Well, I've been to electrical audio a few times. I did my internship there, and I was always observing and listening and documenting. But the last time that I went there, I spent a couple of days recording drums with Steve for a few of my songs. But in the process of doing that, I also wanted to really scrutinise every mic in every placement and fully understand how such an incredible drum sound is achieved. I also wanted to hear in detail the character of that amazing live room in Studio B, and then compare it directly with the adjacent dead room. And in doing all of this, I basically wanted to document Steve's drum recording methodologies as closely as I could. So yeah, that's what I did.
One filter.
During the session, Steve recorded to tape as normal. This was a 14 mic setup, and most of those signals would be grouped and processed before going to tape. In order for me to hear each individual microphone later on, we split the signals after the desk preamp and ran each one unprocessed into a digital multitrack to record simultaneously. I would later acquire details from Steve regarding the processing of each signal so that I could effectively recreate his settings within my DAW.
Okay. Let me know when you're ready. We can try one. Here we go. Sounds like you one pumped it. You coming up?
So Steve, on the session that we've just done,
Yes.
and on the digital multitracks that I took,
Right.
I will need to replicate your settings. So can you talk about
The processing that you do to each microphone.
Each microphone?
Yeah, and how you process that onto tape.
Let me look at the track sheet and I'll run through it with you. Bass drum, 2 microphones. There's a batter side microphone, which is a small condenser microphone called a Countryman Isomax that was dangling down by the beater.
Mm-hmm.
That microphone is also right next to the snare drum, so it tends to pick up a real blat of the underside of the snare every time you hit the snare, and that's generally speaking unflattering and sounds bad. So I have a ducker set up that is one of these Dynamite multifunction dynamics processors. It's set up so that when you hit the snare drum, it ducks that batter side microphone before it has a chance to pick up the blat of the snare drum. Then it goes into this other channel of the Dynamite, which is a fast responding expander, and that trims off all the extraneous noise around that, so it just gets a clean attack sound from the beater. That microphone by itself sounds kind of ridiculous, but it's used to provide definition and attack on the bass drum sound without having to fuck around with the sound on the other bass drum mic. The other bass drum mic is a conventional bass drum mic, and it's right in the mouth of the bass drum. And in this case, that was a Beyer M380. I use that microphone a lot on bass drum. Great low frequency response. It's a bidirectional microphone, so if you get it inside the drum, the null on the sides of the microphone tends to get rid of some of the basketball-like reflections from the interior of the drum, and it hears more of the pistonic movement of the batter head. When it's inside the drum, the back pattern of the figure 8 is also picking up the sound of the resonant head behind it, so you get some degree of that sustaining resonance in that microphone, more than you would with a cardioid style or directional microphone. That microphone was going through this 1176. Very slow attack, medium slow release, 12-to-1 ratio, but not the conventional 12-to-1 where you push the 12 button, but the 4 button plus the 8 button. That changes the operating point of the FET and slightly exaggerates the attack. Mm-hmm. Channel 2 was the snare drum, and that was an ALTEC 175, which is a small diaphragm tube condenser microphone. And I was adding a little bit of high frequency EQ using this NTI shelving equalizer. I was just using the high pass shelf of that and this other high pass here. This is centered around 3.5 kilohertz. So it's a slope at 3.5 kilohertz, and then this band is at 10 kilohertz. The tom microphones, there was a top and bottom microphone on each tom. There was no EQ used on either of those microphones. The bottom microphone of the rack tom had reverse polarity. On the floor tom, the top microphone had reverse polarity. It doesn't really matter which you reverse. I just audition it with flipping one or the other, and then one or the other of them will sound better, and I'll leave it that way. Mm-hmm. Next, there's a stereo track, which is 2 overhead microphones, which are sort of over the shoulder, looking laterally across the cymbals. Those are 2 4038 ribbon microphones. They had high-frequency slope EQ at 10 kilohertz on them. Those were also run through a peak limiter, this BSS peak limiter here. Attack set to 200 microseconds, release set to 500 milliseconds, ratio, infinite ratio. They were probably topping out at about 9 dB of limiting. The function of the peak limiter there is to minimize the interference of the snare drum signal in the overhead with respect to the snare drum sound of the drum kit as a whole. The overhead mics are looking at the snare drum basically, and if you try to use the overheads to bring up cymbal sound, you end up bringing up kind of a distant, crappy version of the snare drum, and so I use the peak limiter to attenuate that.
Is it common that you would put the overheads in that position, like over the shoulder?
Lately, yeah. I started doing that a couple of years ago. I did a session at a studio where they had a house drum kit that was rigged up, and their setup for doing drum recording was just the pair of 4038s over the shoulder of the drummer. And I quite liked the way it sounded. I thought it gave a very nice long sustain to the cymbals, nice brightness, nice attack, not a lot of that sort of bongy, growly sound that you get from cymbals sometimes when you have spot mics on the cymbals. It was just sort of a clean, noisy decay, which I thought was very good. So I've sort of been experimenting with that ever since. So that's kind of a standard position for me now. It didn't used to be, but it is now at this stage. In a year, who knows? I'll try something else and it'll catch my fancy. Those overhead mics are mixed with the stereo microphone in front of the drum kit. The stereo microphone in front of the drum kit was a Neumann SM2 in Blumlein, which is crossed figure 8 pattern. Left and right correspond with left and right from the drummer's perspective. So the figure 8 microphone that's facing in that direction, pointing at the drummer's left, and the overhead mic on the drummer's left side, those are mixed together, and the microphone facing the drummer's right and overhead from the drummer's right are mixed together. Because those microphones are pointed in opposite directions, sometimes it sounds better to reverse the polarity of one or the other of those two things. Once the whole drum kit is put together, I audition reversing the polarity of those, and in this case I left them both flat. It sounded fine the way it was. Then the distant room mics on either side of the drum kit, there's an Octava MK012 with an Omni capsule. I've used a bajillion things in that position in this room. If the drumming is really brash and really fast and has a lot of noise to it, then often I'll use figure 8 microphones as the ambient mics, because then I can tune the null of the figure 8 so that it's picking up less of the most distant reflections and you get a slightly drier sound in the room. In this case I was using Omnis because you're not a thrash drummer. One thing that's important for those ambient mics is for them to have very good low frequency response, and I think those small Octava microphones, despite only being like a $100 microphone, they have really terrific low frequency response. And I delayed those going to tape by 22 and 20 milliseconds respectively, 22 on the left, 20 on the right.
Right.
And normally I start like 15 to 18 milliseconds, and I just scroll the delay until I think it sounds good on a per mic basis. I'll just listen to the drums with one of them, scroll the mic, and then scroll the other one, and then I leave them. Because of the placement in the room and because they're hearing the whole of the drum kit, it's a much more naturalistic sound than if you just send a signal to a reverb unit where you're sending a close mic signal of one part of the drum kit to the reverb unit and getting a return. They're hearing the whole drum kit and they're hearing all the surfaces in the room. So, and that's it. It's your lot.
Can you talk about the E22 microphone?
The mics that were on the toms are E22s. They were made by a guy named David Josephson. And a long time ago, I approached David Josephson about making a microphone specifically for use on drums. The brief being, I wanted a small diaphragm condenser with a side address so that I could stick it in over the top of a drum kit without having a big thing in the way of the drummer. Like part of the design description of the mic was that it needed to be suitable for use on a drum kit, meaning you could whack it with a stick every now and again and it wouldn't break. And so he designed this big heavy brass housing, and then it needed to have a modest output. At the time, a lot of microphone makers were making their output level quite high because that allowed them to sort of cheat the noise floor and publish a very wide dynamic range spec. Like if the noise floor was here and the output level gets really high, well then you have a wide dynamic range and you can boast about your 75, 80 dB dynamic range, whatever. The problem with that is that the high output levels mean that when you're putting it on a loud source, like a drum kit or a guitar amp or something, then the signal level hitting the desk is so hot you can't use it. So it needed to have a modest output level. I tended to favor conventional condenser microphone designs rather than electret. And so that's the way he built it, with a transformer output, very nice transformer made by Lundahl. Very predictable behavior when plugging into transformer coupled mic preamps or electronic mic preamps like we have on our desk here. So having a transformer out on the microphone makes those devices behave more in the way you expect them to.
And they've got a good off-axis sound.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of typical of that design of condenser microphone, is like the physical housing is small enough that it doesn't create a lot of lobing. You know, like if you look at a cardioid pattern for a dynamic microphone in that kind of an arrangement, we'll have a frequency response polar pattern that looks like a bunch of bananas at certain frequencies, you know, just like lobes and notches and all that sort of stuff. So the off-axis sound in those microphones tends to sound kind of shitty. Off-axis on the condenser microphones of that design, it's generally much more controlled. So things like cymbal spillage into the tom mics is less of a problem.
Yeah, yeah. Could you just talk about the importance of the signal chain, right? Starting so how important would you consider the acoustics of the room versus the hardware that you're using?
Well, the thing you're recording, the sound, the acoustic sound of the thing you're recording is the most important thing. Like, if you should be stoked about the way, like if it's your drum kit or your guitar amp or your cello or whatever it is, like you should be fucking stoked about the way that sounds before you even worry about trying to put a microphone on it. Then the positioning of the microphone and the microphone choice are probably comparable in significance. I'm going to say the position of the microphone is probably second most important thing. Like, you should find a spot where if you're listening to that from that spot by ear, it should sound good. You know, like if you're 10 feet away and you're listening to the guitar cabinet and you think it sounds great, but then you stick the microphone right up on the grill, you're not necessarily doing justice to what you were just listening to. But if you get up close to the cabinet and you listen to it and you find a spot in the cabinet and you think, oh yeah, that sounds great, and you put the microphone right where you were just listening, where it sounds great, then you have a better shot at picking up what you're hearing. Drums are slightly special case in that you've got a sort of a clutter. You have a lot of sound sources in very close proximity to each other, so you need to get the microphones very close to get isolation between them. Having said that, I don't generally build the whole of the drum kit sound from isolated close mics. Like, there's a lot of other microphones at play, and the interaction between all the microphones matters. So the thing that you're recording is most important. Location of the mic that you're putting up, second most important. Third most important is choice of microphones. Those two are very close together. Like, if you have an inappropriate microphone in a spot that you think sounds good, the inappropriate microphone is still going to sound bad. You have to listen to what you're about to record, and your sense memory of what different microphones do to different sounds should guide you into choosing an appropriate microphone. Everything downwind from there is much, much less important. Which mic preamp you use, you know, within some very broad parameters, the mic preamp is not that important. Obviously, the mic preamp needs to be able to handle the source impedance of the microphone and the signal level of the microphone without failing or without being at one extreme or the other of its gain range, you know. As far as like the choice of mic preamps is concerned, like in almost every record I've ever made, you know, I do my best to try to make every aspect of the recording sound good. But I think drums are particularly difficult just because there's so many open mics. Mm-hmm. The personality of the drums goes a long way toward defining the character of the music. You know, there's a lot riding on the way the drums come across on a record. So I've spent a lot of my energy trying to make sure that the drums sound good. Mm-hmm. And it's also the first thing that you set up in the session. Like, the first thing you do is set up the drums and get those running.
Yep.
So your attention is on a lot of individual choices, a lot of specific distinctions on the drums. And for essentially all of the records I've made, the drum microphones have gone through the console preamp.
Yeah. Basically,
regardless of what the console is, whether it's like an AMEC or a TAC Scorpion or a fucking, Soundcraft 2 or whatever. It doesn't matter what it is. Getting a bunch of microphones running through the routing to the tape machine conveniently and easily is easier if you don't have to patch in a bunch of individual mic preamps.
Mm-hmm.
So, in this session, I've got 14 microphones up on your drum kit.
Mm-hmm.
They're all going through the desk. And they're going through I do like the preamps in our desk, but if I didn't like the preamps in our desk, it would still be going through the preamps in the desk, just because it's, from a practical standpoint, it's just way easier to get on with the session if you don't have an extra 4 patch cables involved in everything, And if I can control everything from the desk, then I can get through the session a lot faster and easier and get results and don't wear people out with sound checking and stuff like that. Yeah. Whereas if I'm constantly, adjusting levels on a million individual pieces of equipment that are all outboard, it just takes time. It takes energy and burns your attention span. Whereas, I can get up and running much faster and easier if I'm just using the desk, So, and I've worked on desks where I genuinely don't think the preamps are that great. From a practical standpoint, it's still worth it to go
What's
through
not
the desk.
great about them?
Well, more often than not, it's poor maintenance in the studio and dereliction have made the preamps kind of, the gain pots are scratchy, or you have intermittencies, or you have things like that that can be session stopping if they're really bad. But if they're not really bad, I'll still put up with them, Poor matching, impedance matching, or some subtlety about impedance matching. I've noticed that microphones from the 1980s on, that is, active microphones, condenser microphones that have internal electronics, from the 1980s on, there was a kind of a race to the bottom in noise so that the published dynamic range spec would be better, right? So there was consequently, there were 2 developments going on simultaneously. There was people trying to lower the noise floor, people trying to increase the output level. So you'd have very sensitive microphones, very high output level, relatively low noise. Mm-hmm. And going along with that, there was another minor technical race toward lowering the output impedance of microphones, so the microphones would be, a fraction of an ohm output impedance. And I've noticed that some of those microphones behave very strangely with older recording consoles. Like older recording consoles that are transformer coupled are expecting to see, say 150, 300 ohms as a microphone. And when the source impedance of the microphones is down at, a fraction of an ohm or something like that, it looks like a short to that transformer. So then the transformer, trying to pass relatively high current, ends up going into core saturation. This is an effect that was described to me by David Josephson, the microphone maker, and that's why he puts build-out resistors on his microphones. He still has a very low output impedance from the head amplifier, but he uses build-out resistors to bring that up to a nominal 100 ohms or 150 ohms, something like that. So there are some instances where the microphone, whatever microphone you're using, plugged into the console preamp doesn't sound good because of a mismatch of that type, some inconsistency of that type. The different generational eras of microphones don't necessarily work with different generational eras of console. And I've also noticed that a lot of console preamps have a default of 20 or 25 dB of gain, which is in a lot of instances too high. Like if you have high output microphones going into a console that defaults, its minimum setting is 20 dB of gain, you're going to have way too much signal level going through the channel, and you can clip the EQ or you can clip internally or whatever. So then you have to use a pad, and a lot of those pads are designed to be cost efficient, meaning they have poorly matched resistors, or they'll just use like some unused components in a chip set. They'll just shuttle those over to the pad circuit or whatever. So the pads sometimes don't sound good. They sometimes interfere with the sound quality of the microphone. So that's an example of console design where something not thought out might affect the sound quality of the microphone because they were building to a theoretical thing rather than to a practical design, you know. But yeah, so even if the console doesn't have particularly great sounding mic preamps, just being able to use the console preamps is such a convenience and makes the session go so much more smoothly than having to patch everything in individually that I would still default to using the crappy internal mic preamps. For single source recording, where I'm recording a single microphone on a vocalist or whatever, then it's worth it to experiment a little and see if there's some subtlety about the interaction of the mic and the preamp where you prefer one or the other. And I do have my preferences in that sort of scenario, but they're very subtle preferences. Like, Greg Norman, who works here, makes a mic preamp that is in all of our studios, the EA mic preamp, and it's fantastic. He worked on it for years. He's zeroed in on the design. It's got a servo to get rid of all the DC offset. It's transformer coupled. It has a very simple shelving EQ for bass and treble on the output. It can handle an extremely wide range of microphone signal levels and source impedances. You know, everything about it is very well designed, makes a very, very good utilitarian mic preamp. And I tend to prefer using that for critical single source, like single microphone on single thing recording, like for vocalist or guitar overdub or whatever. But there are other mic preamps that I think interface very well with certain microphones. Like the George Massenburg preamps, for example, they are a thoroughly electronic mic preamp. That is, there's no transformers in them. But they have an extremely clean, high gain capability. So you can add 45, 50 dB of gain to a ribbon microphone that you're using on a cello or whatever, and you don't get noise from the system. You just get more gain on the microphone. And they're, super wide bandwidth, so the bass response is really good on them, which is sometimes a weakness of non-transformer coupled mic preamps, is that the bass response tends to sound kind of thin for some reason.
In your opinion, what's the most common mistake that people make in, say, recording drums or placement or?
Well, there's sort of a general problem that I've noticed with semi-professional or home recording, and that is there tends to be way more emphasis on processing than on the acoustics of the sound. So, like, if you put up a microphone on something and it doesn't sound good, your first impulse should not be to try to do something to the sound electronically or in the recording domain. First impulse should be to figure out if that's an inappropriate microphone, if it's in the wrong spot, if the acoustic sound that you're trying to record doesn't sound the way you want it to sound, Try to resolve the problems from the end of the microphone rather than from sitting in the chair, So yeah, I would say an unwillingness to get up out of the chair and fix what is an acoustic problem or a microphone choice or positioning problem rather than trying to fiddle with the sound electronically. That's like the number one thing, but that's more of a general problem than it relates specifically to drums. The other thing is that if the drum kit is set up in a way that is at odds with what your aesthetic is, then you're never going to get a sound that you like because it's just the wrong instrument. It's like playing a piano and expecting it to sound like an organ. So if you want like a big, booming, open, resonant drum kit, and you have a sort of modest sized kit with very old, very dead heads and a pillow in the bass drum and all that sort of stuff, there's nothing that you can do beyond that to make that drum kit sound like the one you're imagining. You know, you have to have the acoustic sound basically right before you can record it and have it sound the way you want it to sound. You know? But that's also, I guess, sort of a general problem. Sort of practical stuff. Pay attention to the tuning of the drums. The choice of drum heads affects the sound quality kind of a lot. Single-ply heads are more resonant than multi-ply heads. Multi-ply heads are deader sounding and generally work better with lower tunings. Yeah, having new unrippled heads makes a big difference. The dimples in the heads tend to add a lot of extraneous noise and unpredictable resonances. One thing I would advise for recording drums is that there's a kind of a conventional wisdom about what microphones are useful for what things. Like when I was starting in the 70s and 80s, you would basically only ever see an SM57 on a snare drum. Like there was basically no other microphone used. And you know, the SM57 has its acolytes, and I'm not going to try to convince people they don't like something, but I haven't found much use for it as a microphone myself. So my first big experimental foray was trying to find a microphone I liked on snare drum. And I went through a lot before I found a few that I could even, found a few that I thought were even remotely accurate. And I've tended to settle on condenser microphones for snare drum. I feel like the quick response to transients, the full frequency response, all those things, and generally pretty predictable patterns as well. Those things tended to make a big difference in how useful the snare drum recording was for me. So I would say don't take anybody else's word for what mic you should use where. You know, experiment with stuff and develop your own tastes and develop your critical facilities as well. Like if the rule of thumb is that you put a Sennheiser 421 on the floor tom, and that's what floor toms sound like, then if you just follow that conventional wisdom, you're not really learning anything about what your tastes are and the way the microphones behave in that position, that sort of thing. So I would experiment aggressively with different mic choices for things.
Well, listen, Steve, thanks so much for everything. Thanks for putting up with the digital stuff.
I didn't have to touch it. Didn't even notice it.
All the patching and all the figuring out, I really appreciate all of that. And,
no worries.
Yeah, it's been cool.
All right, congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Good luck with your record.
Cheers, Steve.
As soon as you said all the patching, I realized that I hadn't unpatched it. All right, I'm going to get on my bike and go home, and if I make dinner from the wife, and
Will you be here tomorrow?
I should be, yeah.
Okay. I'll
See you then.
Thanks, Steve.
Yep.
Really enjoyed it.
No sweat. See you tomorrow.
Thanks, man.
See you
See you
later.
later.